thank you really seriously all for staying. I want to thank all the participants, especially those of you who have come from considerable distances, and especially from great distance, for your willingness to participate, and thank everyone for really quite remarkable contributions across the board, I think, over the course of these 2 days. And to everyone who's been here, we've lost a few people as time passes. The level of conversation, I think, has been extremely high. In order to give us all a chance to think about what we've done, what remains to be done, I've asked my good friends and colleagues, Jonathan Arac, who you all know is the Director of the Humanities Center here at Pitt and Mellon Professor of English, and my friend Tony Bogues, who's I assume will not upset by my informality, precisely because I'm about to read his full title, which is the Asa Mezer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory, Professor of Africana Studies at Brown, and Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, who inside that title has taken the time to come and spend several days with us. And as I understand, Tony will be here on Monday. Is that correct? In the Humanities Center, giving this speech, which I will have to miss, and the title of that would be?
Amy Césaire, France Fanon, and Freedom and Emancipation.
Césaire, Fanon, Freedom and Emancipation, 5:30.
5:30 in the Humanities Center, which is right upstairs.
So I think what they've decided to do is each person will begin with a few remarks, and then I'm sure there'll be time for questions and discussion, and not just aimed up and back, but I hope around the room as well. Okay? But we have this room until about 5 or 5:15, so we should be okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You took a more than usually leadership role in composing this program, and it's been a fantastic success. We are all extraordinarily in your debt. It's been a terrific set of papers. The mix of disciplines and perspectives has been remarkable. I would like also, in getting started here, to say that as part of the not quite hour that follows, I hope that some of you who have been present and thinking hard, but not raising your hands lest the thoughts fall out, will share with us some of your thoughts in this conversation. But also, of course, those who have spoken a lot may wish to speak more because you have good things to say. I'll speak for about another 5 minutes, maybe. Tony might take 10 minutes, and then we'll open it for larger discussion. First off, thinking about the 6 papers that we've had, it seems to me that I'm just going to make a division into 2 clusters for suggestion's sake, and not do anything more with that. It seems to me that the papers by Balaban and Columbia and Pedersen cluster together well, and that the papers by Simpson and Borg and Robbins cluster well, which doesn't mean that there aren't other connections to make, but it's just to say that out of all the disparities and differences, that we, with our large blank check title, got 2 pretty good clusters, seems to me a sign that the idea bringing us together has begun to yield. Challenged by Bruce's calling for a longer history, let me just throw out off the top of my head a thought: the militarization of knowledge. Certainly a modern problem in some chronological sense of modernity. Maybe in a longer history, we also need to remark on what we could call the epistemologization of war. That is to say, if one thinks about the Iliad, there's a lot of craft, a lot of know-how, but it seems that that what war is about there is about heroic prowess attached to notions of divinity. And by 1800, in the long leap that we're all familiar with, you have places like the recently founded École Polytechnique in West Point as not just military institutions for training people who will be leading military figures, but actually the places in their respective nations for the study of advanced engineering. So there seems to be a big change in what the military demands of the people who are going to be its notable figures, and I've just tried in the crudest way to sketch that. Now, one of the questions I think that has not haunted because it's been part of the discussion, but that's recurred in our 2 days, is the question of what the relationship is between militarization and politicization. And insofar as the military is a component of the state, it's clear why that should be a potential confusion or blur or uncertainty. And in that context, it was striking that for Balaban's talk, it was all the state. And in Columbia's talk, it's all anti-state. And they're beautiful twins in that respect. Part of what I was continuing to think about from David Columbia's talk is the question as, are all weapons military weapons? And likewise, is all agonism, competition, wish to win, wish to be ahead, wish to be first, is that all military? So those are boundary drawing questions. And I'm going to try one more set of boundary drawings as a possible frame, totally ad hoc, totally to be knocked down. So a typology, a four-element typology of militarization of knowledge. One, the military uses pre-existing knowledge. Two, the military produces new knowledge. Three, the military preforms what can emerge as knowledge. Or four, the military touches or taints knowledge. And as an example of what I'm thinking of there, let me just offer a pregnantly controversial example. So, Cold War, 1957, Russia launches a satellite that circles the Earth, Sputnik. US responds. One of the responses is the National Defense Education Act. One of the responses within that is the idea, good thing if Americans know more about the world than they did otherwise. It's not only science that the NDEA funds. Title IV of the NDEA not only funded language study, comparative literature, even funded English. People got PhDs in English funded by the National Defense Education Act. And yet it's hard to believe that that was a real militarization of knowledge as opposed, for example, what we might, in those happy days, have called the exploitation of the military or of the concern for defense in order to make funding available to things that have nothing particular to do with it. I don't know, but I also understand that there's a touch or a taint there. So that's it for me. Now you have Tony, and then we'll have you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I want to begin by thanking Professor Bogues for asking me to, not quite sure what to do, but I think reflect on the proceedings for the last day and a half. What I want to do in those reflections is to speak to three areas. One, think about the significance of this present discussion. Secondly, suggest perhaps a alternative genealogy, another way to think through questions of modernity that does not necessarily begin with the Las Casas debate, but perhaps begins prior to that, to the encounter of 1492, which Professor Minto has written about, and to remind us that that encounter and the historical processes which it generated were described by Marx in Capital. Primitive accumulation, he says, comes into the world dripping with blood. And precisely what does that dripping with blood means and marks for us as we think about questions of so-called modernity. And then to talk a little bit about, thirdly, to talk a little bit about questions that are raised both in the papers here, but also in the general discussion around issues of militarization and of militarization and knowledge. In beginning to think about the significance, I want to just remind us of our earlier ways in which, in the 20th century, the military and knowledge were in bed, so to speak. And I want to think about the formation of area studies and the way in which area studies was formed in this country and its relationship to the Defense Force, and the way in which it came, and the different area studies programs formed all over the United States in different universities, and the Title VI money that they got and how they got that money and where that money came from, and where it was about, quite frankly, a study of the so-called decolonized ex-colonial countries to find out how do we manage them in this those populations in the middle of the Cold War. So there's a particular history and a particular relationship between the so-called research universities, area studies, forms of knowledge, and, if you wish, military objectives. And just to really remind us that military objectives are also political objectives. There's a way in which I think sometimes we may think that there is a line of a Chinese war which separates military objectives from political objectives and focus on the military without, not realizing that in fact military objectives are, and that's basic, are really about political objectives. But in trying to think through, therefore, this particular significance, I want to think about a framework for a discussion of a kind of possible alternative genealogy in which we may want to think through some of these things. And that genealogy really focuses on questions of colonial power, focuses on questions of racial difference, and really see these phenomena not as episodic ones, not ones that are external to the actual system or just shapes the system in some tangential way, but perhaps ones that are actually constitutive itself of the ways of life and of the system itself, and therefore becomes forces of what one may call of overdetermination. But that in that overdetermination, if you wish, that there is generated a certain kind of production, a production of grounds on which we stand that creates certain kind of discursive and historical ways in which we actually operate. And that in those discursive and historical ways, we actually draw intellectual resources from them, sometimes without even acknowledging that we've drawn some of these intellectual resources. Let me continue. I was going to show a clip, but I only have 10 minutes, so let me not do the clip. Let me remind you of a statement from a complicated figure in French thought, Simone Weil. Complicated because sometimes you're not quite sure where she stands on things. But this is what she says in the 1930s. She says, the most effective method to approach warfare, she says, is in terms of ends, rather than not thinking about the nature of the means employed. That is, we think about the study warfare typically in terms of ends. And what she's arguing is that that's actually a defective method, and that we may want to think about the means that are employed. Ends usually leads us to try and think about questions of moral justification, just war, etc. When, was this, do we do this rightly, or with some justice, can we do this, and so on. But the means may also pose a different set of questions to us that we might want to think about. Because the means I would want to suggest to you means that we think about weapons, means that we think about practices, and means also that we have to think about technologies of violence itself. And I just want to pause here 1 minute and think about one particular technology of the 21st century, drones. What is interesting to me was the last paper, and I apologize for having to leave about 20 minutes because I wanted to quickly make these notes. But what was interesting to me was the installation and the first shot of that installation, first part, well, the death of Watson, and the young men inside the video room, and then the scenery outside of the tank, and so on. And what is interesting to me in trying to think about that is that here you have now a process of warfare without risk. Without risk to those who are deploying war, the method of war. That there is then this argument of doing warfare without risk, and the arguments about drone, is that some folks have argued that drone, and here I'm quoting one person, is the most ethical method of warfare known to humankind. It's not my quote. And it is the most ethical, they argue, because it minimizes risk. Now, it doesn't minimize risk for the Pakistani or the person, or so-called collateral damage, but it minimizes the risk for combatants. What is interesting, therefore, is that in this minimalization of risk, is that therefore the nature of warfare is transformed. War is no longer about combatants, but it is raw boots on the ground, as some people talk about, although that still happens. But that really, what you have are different or virtual becomes important. And what you have is a way in which, therefore, the right to kill is then it really operates at a push of a button. What that means is that the typical masculine aesthetics about war and competence, courage, virtues of certain kind of masculine solidarities and so on, all those things go out the window. You don't need those kind of things if you are sitting down in a room actually pushing a button. And what that also means, in my view, is that you therefore begin to think about these weapons lead us to think about the states of violence and violence itself. And what does it create? What actually does it generate? Part of the way in which this thing happens, as you all know, is about identification of militants. And what is interesting is that accompanying the business of drones is a process which has been called a pattern of life analysis. And this pattern of life analysis is about trying to say, okay, who do you meet, who do you call, where do you drink with your friends, etc., etc. And then you develop this particular pattern, and then you say, okay, if this is this person does this, then actually we can find this person, we can track this person, we can target this person, and then we can out this person. What for me is fascinating is to think about the Pakistani man whose family was a target of drone attacks, and this is what he says. They say we were terrorists, but we were common people, and this is what I like with the statement. We are common people with beards. And what if you follow some of the actual discussion between people in the room where the young men are trying to thinking about where they should drop where the drone should strike. And I mean, there's one thing that was published in the New York Times that people would say, guy says, what does he have there? What is he hiding? Is it a sweater or is a gun is inside there? I mean, in other words, it is a guessing game because what can you see from 20,000 feet? Which is how high it flies. What precisely can you see? that is in that kind of detail to be able to identify somebody. So it therefore seems to me that what happens therefore in modern 21st warfare, what we're on the verge of, is the transformation of war between combatants, and that still happens. And therefore what also happens is that war becomes a matter of hunting. So you hunt somebody. You find their lifestyle, you track them, then you target them. So you are in the process of hunting. And what one then has to ask is, what is the process? What does that do to the state? What does that do to sovereign power when sovereign power behaves in that way? In other words, it's not now the deployment of a certain force, let's say a group of people, civilian army or volunteer army or whatever, or conscripted army, whatever, but it is that you are involved in a process of hunting all the time to take out who you consider to be key figures. In my view, therefore, what that means is that sovereign power operates as the right to kill, and therefore the sword is really the might of the sword. And then one would say, yeah, okay, that's true. And one would say, yeah, that's sovereign power in a certain biopolitical way. But I want to complicate that immediately by going back to what I'm thinking about, a different genealogy. To suggest to you that in the business of thinking about modernity as inaugurated with a certain kind of genocide that was dripping with blood, use Marx's phrase, and with certain racialized bodies and so on, that what you have is a way in which power and violence are not separate in the way Arac will talk about it, but are actually that violence is power. And Arac has a really famous line in one of her works in which she says, and I like her a great deal, in fact I love her, I think, even though I shed a quarrel all the while when I read her work. And she has a line in it in which she says that if a robot, she says, then pushes, if we have soldiers who become robots, who then will push a button, she says, that will then cause destruction. Then she says, at that point, then the ascendancy of power is overtaken by violence. And I read that and thought to myself, oh yes, I know, you missed the point. What you missed the point is that there is a certain way in which within modernity, or what I like to call colonial modernity, violence is in fact power itself. And then what we might want to think through is by thinking a way in which, therefore, these technologies, what Simon Veal talks about, these technologies, means of war, which then become technologies, then, in fact, generate a set of practices themselves which draw from a repertoire of power that has to do with the questions of natives and of racialized bodies. And therefore, to think about this relationship of war and so on, not just in a way in which, therefore, war is over here, imperialism is over here, and that the state is somewhere over here, right? But that there is, in fact, a set of relationships, and that those historical relationships shape a certain kind of sediment deposit, which I talk about, and that in those sediment deposits, it is not now that in the Agamben way we are in a state of exception, but that a state of exception always existed in modernity. And that state of exception did not need constitutional reform or a suspension of constitution to happen. It was the law. Slavery was a law. It had laws to buttress it. Colonialism had laws to buttress it. And so these are not exceptions and a kind of, okay, somehow we are going back to something else. It is that how these things actually become what I call, operate in a way of overdetermination. So there's no really homo sacer, I would argue, in the Agamben sense, but what you have are natives and black bodies that become marked. So, what is it, therefore, we should kind of, if you wish, think about? And let me just say one thing quickly to say I'm not, one is what some people think is, oh, he's talking at an extreme. One of the things that fascinated me about the debates in the Bush administration and its drive in Iraq were such debates about cruel and unusual punishment. And when is it that punishment will become cruel and unusual? And one of the fascinating things to me was the legal precedent that was drawn up for this. Was a case in the 19th century in which an ex-slave actually charged his master for beating him too much. And where the argument about what is cruel and what is unusual punishment was debated by the justice at that point in North Carolina. And fascinating to me was to find how the legal people and documents are all there for us to see the lawyers actually make reference to that case as to where one is punishment cruel and unusual. And therefore, my argument is really a simple one. It's not a kind of trying to think about history as, on historical grounds as a kind of over, and trying to accuse people of not being historical. Is really trying to say we might want to think about the alternative sets of histories and genealogies. And we might want to think about the relationships of questions of power, or issues of power, in different ways to begin to understand how it operates today. So that the argument is really a simple one, is that moments of the new, quite frankly, operate with elements of the old. It's an old Hegelian argument, right? But it's actually, is also an argument, I think, of Stuart Hall, and I think is important. Significance. Firstly, I think that this workshop has been, or conference has been significant, because we have begun to think through the questions of military and knowledge. I think what is important is to think through the business of the research university. What is the role of the research university today? Pitt is a research university. The university I come from, Brown, says it's a university, a research university. What we need to map today, in my view, the links between the research university and the questions of military and knowledge, and the ways in which those play out. Secondly, I want to also try and think about the business of things like affect, things of the human terrain thing which collapse. But to think through ways in which, therefore, cognitive science, psychology, and so on, now become very important tools for not just the soldiers, but for torture methods, for the ways in which actually the military is going to proceed and to act in a certain ways, and to also and to think about those things, in my view, in relationship to what does that mean for us to think about critical thought today. What does it mean when a state behaves, and this is an imperial state, and I take that as given. But what does it mean when a state operates, the so-called liberal state, liberal imperial state, operates in a way that it now operates when it is transforming the actual nature of war itself? What does it mean for sovereignty? What does it mean for us to be able to identify? How can we identify that state? Does it transform the nature of liberalism, or does it not? Or is there something else that we need to think about? And that these are not questions that are abstract or academic questions. They are not academic questions, or in the quote unquote in the academic sense, in quotation, because I think one of the things that we want to think about if we think about this question of militarization, of the military, and of knowledge, and practices, is that you want to go back to Ferguson. You want to go back to the ways in which we saw on the streets in this country the police using military surpluses, and then we suddenly realized the close relationship, if we didn't know it before, between what the military does and the relationship between questions of the state and security, in all its form. That these are not just abstract questions, these are questions of a set of practices that we might just want to, as so-called critical intellectuals, to think about. So those are my reflections, Paul.
Thank you. So, okay, there's a hand. Nancy?
So I'm still haunted by this notion of the historical frame that we bring to this question, if we periodize it, how do we do so? And I want to start with the comments that each of you made about Title VI and area studies as being a kind of moment at which, not a genesis moment, but a moment at which the story takes up a certain kind of traction or velocity, and therefore is a useful moment to plausibly begin to make a certain kind of argument. For me, that argument would very briefly sound something like this, that the moment where OSS, Office of Strategic Services, begins to collect university intellectuals, people like Vera Dunham or Maurice Friedberg, or those people that then entered into, already were recognized academics and helped in setting up OSS, and then made the transition into CIA and dropped out, returned to the university, and yet their contributions had an imprint on places like University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign that became what would you call it, the holding place for all publications, much more than the Library of Congress, strategically the holding place deep in the center of the United States for American knowledge and American libraries, and places to which we were routinely offered free lodging for several weeks at a time to do our research, those of us that were in Soviet studies. These were our teachers, and we were funded to go and carry out our research at University of Illinois. And so indeed, if you skip ahead to say 57 and Sputnik, as the moment at which, again, there's traction and velocity in the militarization of knowledge, a key moment, it triggers then intense study of Russian, and scholars slightly older than I began in '64. So what was that, 6 years, 7 years later? But the boom in studying the language of the enemy and the tendency to militarize and securitize our knowledge comes from that period of time of 57, say, to 64, and then the blossoming of Title VI. If I were to look backwards and try to periodize it more capaciously, I won't speak for your field because you would have to make your own arguments, but my field would start looking at something like the secularization of knowledge at a kind of starting point for something that brings us up to 57. And in Russian studies, at least, that the secularization of knowledge starts relatively late, 1840s, for example, 1848. It became possible in the university setting to teach secular philosophy. It then hits up against revolutions of 48 and gets knocked back again. But basically, you could arguably connect the dots between, say, 1840s as secular philosophy becomes possible to teach in the university forward to 1940. So it's really only a century there where you begin to see the movement from secularization of knowledge to militarization of knowledge. And then if you were to move forward into the present day and potentially, arguably, the future, the hot issue at the university where my research interests lie, the key phrase is the weaponization of information. So it's something that turns up every single day in Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, in Vineyard of the Saker, and other kinds of lists that we daily follow that has to do with the way in which one could weaponize information, which is an interesting metaphor, particularly in the context of what we're talking about here. And at the heart of it, the most ironic moment in that debate is this, that we talk about the importance, the Russians are weaponizing information, and how should we respond ethically, strategically, and so forth. We respond, among other ways, by pouring enormous amounts of money into our weaponization of information, including currently something like $16 million of federal funding into what we call independent media from our side, independent media. And so we're in this deliciously ironic situation in which our concept, our working understanding of independent media is that which is funded by the US government to the tune of $16 million. And yet we can shamelessly retort to the Russians. We have independent media, which is of course underwritten by the US government completely, and is likely to be more thoroughly. But that's the connection that I would like to make from secularization to militarization to the weaponization of information. So
I think hearing a multiplicity of voices will be a good thing now. I have spoken, Tony has spoken, Nancy has spoken. You can speak to any of our points, or you can speak to any of the things that have crossed your mind over 2 days and 6 speakers and rich discussion. What's the thing that we shouldn't leave this room without thinking more about?
Paul, I see you're eager. So
I'm not eager. I'm never eager to do this. I said earlier in passing that it seemed to me that almost every talk, and if not explicitly in each talk, then certainly in the questions that came from the floor, the problem of judgment surfaced. Sometimes it was addressed directly, other times left as an indirect topic of other conversation. But I had the feeling that, and this involves the university, it involves the internet, it involves the described system of knowledge production in the Pentagon's flowcharts. I have the feeling that what we are, and I will allude back as well to Bruce Robbins's talk, which seemed to register a normative trend in the formerly critical fields of knowledge that has set aside the very idea of judgment as an essential part of their identity. I'll raise the question of whether or not the results of the various forces that have undergirded all of the trajectories that we've been describing and analyzing in the last few days don't coalesce affectively, institutionally, intellectually, and politically around the abrogation of judgment as a functioning category within the social order. So that drone warfare certainly distances us from judgment and normalizes it by sanitizing the way. The way in which internet terrorists develop, thinking both of your talks now, develop a willing suspension of disbelief that's to be permanent. Suggests again the necessity of suspending judgment in an affect that's flat. Right? We were talking about the flatness of affect. It's one of the effects inside of terror regime. So I'm wondering if anyone has any thought about the continuing efficacy of judgment. I hear the passion of judgment, what Tony is reminding us we should do in the effort to produce alternative genealogies. One must then judge that there's a need for alternative genealogies. I don't know, am I hearing a problem about judgment that's unreal and it's just my hobby? I do think the Literary Academy has decided that judgment is not an acceptable process. It has not only made critique an object to be dismissed, but has made the act of positive scholarship rather than the act of criticism a good thing. That's not to embrace the notion that we have to reduce everything to rubble or believe everything is rubble, but we can't not have things become rubble if we cannot differentiate and make offers of judgment. So I will stop there.
One thing that brings to mind, which I brought to mind before a little bit, which Tony's talk also comments about Arendt on judgment, right? I was thinking about that in Andrews' talk too, that she makes this interesting connection between Kant on aesthetics, right, and what she wants to see as like deep political judgment, right, which she thinks, she argues that that work is political in a way that it's not familiar unless we've read Arendt and a few other people. And the idea that there could be something related in the sort of push pressure against judgment in the academy that we are seeing, and the pressure against sort of political education more broadly, strikes a chord with me, right? And I guess I was even thinking of Anders' thing, like there's a sort of taking over of the aesthetics of the field of warfare, right? In which I guess something, I mean, I've shifted to a different thing, and I'm sorry, but I was thinking about how those recruiting games are drenched with affect, right? Like your response is supposed to be, right? But once you're actually in the military, you showed this really, like, it's all flattened out, right? There's like, so there is like this pursuit of the aesthetic in the person outside that recruits them in, and then like no more judgment whatsoever. And it does seem like a way of managing, soliciting and managing the entire judging apparatus of the person, right? And sort of forestalling any sort of questioning of the, as maybe we saw in the talk yesterday, right? You know, you're not going to question the most basic things, which to a Arendt person would be the thing you should be raising the questions about.
I was thinking of the history of judgment philologically, and wondering if in fact we're asking for the wrong thing, because going back to the third critique, where what fascinates Kant is the apparent subsumability of judgments and of the power of judging under concepts, the fact that there is finally no conceptual superstructure sustaining them. And the history of that has produced, it seems to me, an increased attention to the apparent relativism of all judgments. That is to say, everyone's as good as another. And so when we simultaneously have a world in which information on which we might base judgments is being denied or scrambled, and at the same time an undercutting of judgment itself as an inherently subjective, albeit transcendental idea, not concept, idea. What you really may be talking about is truth, a much more difficult and simpler and old-fashioned word, in which the things you would need in order to take a position on something, what you're calling judgment, are no longer, one has to fight for them to be available. One has to fight for the information to be available on which some kind of decision might be taken about what it's worth and where it goes. And I'm just wondering if judgment is, I know what you mean, but I'm wondering if that's the word we want.
The word is trouble, I agree.
And I'm wondering if we're not really talking about evidence.
Yeah. A perfect scientific word.
Yeah, I know.
But I'm uncomfortable, I'm not so uncomfortable with the truth, I would be uncomfortable with the statement that we can't do what we might do because we don't have the information.
Well, the information actively being denied to us.
Yes, okay, but
you have to hunt for it.
I'm not sure that, go back to the problem of experience, I'm not sure that we need more in some ways than the fact of knowledge being denied to us.
Yeah.
The fact of information being denied to us. To have the knowledge and the experience that we don't know what we need to know. I take it that that's part of what Tony is saying. He suggests we need alternative genealogies. I'm also thinking that's a little bit like what Collini was saying in his first talk. Not all of you may have heard his first talk about the university when he was suggesting that throughout the structures of the university is, and I think we all see this now, the institution is designed, even in such fundamental notions as tenure, the institution is designed to assure a place for judgment / responsibility, and it lays out some sense of which, the terms in which those capacities are to be exercised. Yet the processes in place preempt almost inevitably the enactment of often by deferring. So you can take the very concrete matter of, say, the way a tenure case would work, giving games away in some way, but that's fine. It's often the case that a tenured faculty will defer judgment to external experts.
Yeah.
Right? Or to press reviewers of a book manuscript.
Yeah.
And so you find a deferral of judgment, a deferral of the willingness to act, and therefore the deferral of what would be the corresponding obligation to articulate the political basis on which you would make that.
The way you're putting it, Paul, you're making it sound like it's our problem. We are not exercising judgment. And that's what troubles me.
Yes, and
Because
maybe making a specific instance.
And I'm saying, give me the information and I will exercise what you're calling judgment, if I trust the information. What you're talking about, alternative genealogy, that's information. I can deal with that. I don't have to be relativized off the face of the earth in order, professing myself an inexpert on this, that, and the other. Simply in the face of flowcharts from the Defense Department or the impenetrable lingo of hackerspeak. If I'm presented with information, as we were so elegantly by David, in a way that I can understand, I can make my mind up. So it's not my fault. I'm speaking for us all. I'm not exercising judgment. It's not a moral failing on my part that I'm abnegating judgment. It's a problem of information, which I'm calling for shorthand truth.
It's also, I think, a problem with affect, because I'm struck by the passion with which you defend your ability to make the judgment. And not everyone feels as passionately as you do about exercising that capacity.
I see.
And I'm also suggesting that and that's one of the affect flatnesses that we've been talking about. It does appear sometimes as what we could call an older language of derogation of responsibility. And I'm also, by my instance a moment ago of the tenure case, suggesting that institutional processes, just to take one small instance of the way this whole structure might be in place, right, works to defer judgment, to remove it from a passionate person who wants to know, and instead says, well, the judgment has been made for us. We can look to, and then you fill in the blank. And that, especially when persons consent within such an apparatus, then implicitly they are flattening the very passion of politics and judgment that you're saying is a capacity you have. It's quite possible that you're unique.
I'm not quite sure how to take that one.
I think Anders is trying to say that.
Well, I was wondering, some of your comments as well, whether there are sort of two types or maybe even traditions of judgment that are worth considering. Going back to Kant, he has a notion of what he calls logical tact, which is then picked up by Clausewitz, who then talks about the tact of judgment. The tact des Urteils, which he says in the military context is particularly apt for making decisions. But it's a kind of judgment that is based on sort of pre-rational, precisely Fingerspitzengefühl, whereby you bypass the reflective judgment and learn some kind of pattern recognition that then makes you simply act.
On the teleological principle.
What's that, sorry?
On the teleological principle.
Please explain.
Kant gives us this principle, not a concept, of telos, of end, that guides one to work through chance. Right? So that short circuit interactive with judgment allows you in the moment of activity to decide to move, right? It's still based upon the teleology, the telos, right? Which he offers as a principle. It itself has an important history in the context of what Tony's talking about, because he invents the teleological judgment on the problem of race. It rescues the issue of the concepts in Unterschaft to get around the question of reason, but it's a rescue that he's borrowed from his racial discourses, in which he begins with the problem of difference, which is quite simply this: why do black people stink? In straight language, right? And he wants to support his notion of monogenesis of the species in differentiation, so he has to generate this capacity to move before indeterminacy and yet maintain what's the most utmost thing for you, which is the subject of judgment and the subject of knowledge, which of course is the basis for the rational moral order, which is going to be the basis of the state. So what's behind all of this is a fundamental anthropology that cannot be disarticulated from its historical circumstances, so that constitutively all of the discussion we're having about judgment and knowledge is still based upon a taxonomy of being and its construct anthropology. Right? And that history is very important. We alight it at tremendous risk, because then we lose the fundamental issue that Jonathan Jordan came up with, trying to elaborate. What is the history of the state? And I understand when he says alternative history not to be seeking new evidence, but rather to engage with the ongoing practices of life that have been in front of our face, but that the very structure of knowledge, we keep going back to Kant, prevents us from seeing. This is the same Kant that could, while he was very much opposed to violence, could understand the French Revolution as demonstrating human capacity to generate itself, but would refuse to see it. Emphatically. Right? And that's an epistemic défaillance, as the Arac calls it, appropriately and rightly so. And you can't get past that. You can't get past it. You have to stop and start all over again. And so the other practices that have been occurring in tandem with that need to be engaged, and they are being engaged. And so the question for us, going back to Paul's point about the structure of the institution, is whether or not there are forces on the ground right now in the world offering us the opportunity, compelling us to reimagine. Right? And if that's the case, we can't keep going back to time.
Okay, so thank you for this, which I did not know. My point was a different one, though. My point was that once it's picked up, this notion of the logical attack by Clausewitz, then he articulates, I think, a form of knowledge which is absolutely key to how the military functions. And I think that entire history, or that conception of judgment, which bypasses reflection, which has to be operative and so on, needs somehow to be connected to the more reflective sense that we otherwise have of judgment. And well, look at the first paper and look at sort of the perspective that, at least through someone like Bogues, tried to offer on how things are working. I think within the categories in which the first paper operated, it made perfect sense. What's being argued: the protection of one's soldiers, the ability to generate further knowledge gains, and so on. But if you don't have the ability to step outside of that framework, then you lack, I think, something quite important. Which
to Paul's point, I don't mean to.
Okay.
An argument about the
which I would say is a kind of more reflective judgment that comes from the outside position.
But the movement of deferral of judgment in the essence of that first paper is illustrative. And it came up in the question of the ethical. And the response is, well, the operation and practice of judgment is deferred to a committee. It's completely bureaucratic. So that even the discourse about protecting the soldier, which becomes very affective, is a particular kind of fiction of a very specific order. Because now the soldier is abstracted, right? And it's abstracted in a very explicit discourse of patriarchal patriotism that completely disregards the social forces that compel that volunteer soldier to be that volunteer soldier. So all of a sudden, an army that is predominantly not white and is there for economic purposes, that's part of a continuum of a structure of violence that is the power, which is what makes them such damn good soldiers or not, is blanqueamiento, is a whitening of it. It's neutralized, and we can talk about the abstract soldier, who's the transcendental subject that we're protecting, and that justifies us. And that's a wonderful performance precisely of the deferral of judgment, and putting it back on the schematic in order to do what? To redeem one's own presupposed ethical integrity. So it's about how one feels about oneself, regardless of what one do. So to want to reconnect it to the reflective is a redundant gesture that I have to ask historically, why would we want to engage in such an event? What's at stake? To what purpose? How can we vulnerably want to redeem that and make that movement? Why?
Fair enough.
Abigail has handed me a piece of paper with the magical words on it that say, Genug. Fin. End of the road. Because the police will be here.
And it will be pretty.
Why is everyone looking at me when you say that?
If we don't leave this overheated, darkened space very soon. So thank you all very much.